Dragon Quest is an immensely important game series. Yuji Horii has been designing and directing these games for more than 40 years. It is a series that holds numerous accolades in Japan, but has never really been able to transfer that popularity over to the West. Within this series, Dragon Quest III is especially beloved, often considered one of the best to this day despite being so old. So this remake was put under a microscope from the first second. It had to be done properly, no matter what. Square Enix has been pushing the HD-2D style hard. I'm going to talk about the game's visuals later in this review, but it's a core aspect of this game's identity. It's still hilarious that the real name of this game is Dragon Quest III HD-2D. But how does this crusty old game hold up today? Is an NES game blasted with post-processing effects worth playing these days, and does it have any merit over its numerous other versions? Well, I love this game. I think it delivers on just about everything I wanted as a fan of this series and as a fan of the original. And I would like to tell you all about it. Before we dive in, I think it's good to go over my personal history with Dragon Quest III and just the Dragon Quest series. I've only played one version of this game, the mobile remake, which was later ported to Switch. It is kind of ugly, with a weird mismatching of art styles, but it is still otherwise a solid remaster that faithfully presents the original game with the quality of life changes added in the SNES and Game Boy remakes. I've also played the first two this way, and I'm currently playing Dragon Quest IV for the original NES, which gives me some perspective for this. But this game is a lot more than a remaster. It is from the ground up a full remake. Anytime I refer to the original, just keep in mind that my only experience is with the Switch version, so I can make educated guesses, but I'm not speaking from my exact understanding. Without further ado, let's discuss Dragon Quest III HD-2D. So first things are these visuals. HD-2D has honestly become more of an infamous trend than a popular one. It started out with immense support, but I think the majority of RPG fans have turned against it by this point, with the Octopath Traveler series, Triangle Strategy, and similar remakes like Star Ocean's Second Story R and Live Alive. I have my issues with the style as well. I like the idea of it, rather than removing pixels, prettying them up with modern particle effects, lighting, and things like that in a 3D setting. It's interesting. But a lot of the time, it is just far too an extreme of an effect. Especially in Octopath, the lighting, bloom, and depth of field are just way too strong. A majority of the image is fuzzy, and it's hard to tell those beautiful pixels underneath. However, with all that said, I do like how this game looks. As you can see, the extra effects are nowhere near as extreme. I like the 3D settings, and I think the sprite work is pretty. But I do understand if people don't like this. A criticism I've heard about similar games is they don't like the pixels on 3D backgrounds. Personally, I don't agree. I think since the pixel density is incredibly high, it looks like pixel art, rather than some 8-bit against high poly backgrounds. I find it a cute mixing of styles, though I seem to be in the minority, and this is something that can't exactly be debated. I think the game looks great. You'll be able to decide how you feel after a trailer or two. A lot have been done to update the visuals while preserving the art of the original. The other major part of the game's presentation is the music, which I think is quite beautiful. The game is packed with themes that fill you with an instant feeling of nostalgia, even if you have no past with the series. I think the score's wonderful and does everything you want from a release like this. But now let's actually get into how the game plays. It is a traditional JRPG through and through. While there have been slow additions through each iteration of this game, it still has NES combat at its core. But it is incredibly well executed, and proves itself worthy to stand toe-to-toe with modern RPGs. Your actions are taken turn by turn, with the order determined by the character's speed stat. You select all of your actions, watch them play out until you can choose again. You've got your HP and your MP, which increases as you level up. You slowly gain new skills after each level, depending on your class. There are a number of classes in this game, each with their own role to play and varying effectiveness. The protagonist is a hero, a unique class to just them with well-rounded capabilities. The warrior can dish out damage while also being a pretty sturdy tank. Martial artists have a focus on speed and attack with high critical hit chances. The thief can steal from enemies, it's quite nimble and even has access to some magic. The Monster Wrangler is a new class in the HD-2D Remake, so we're going to discuss that more in depth later. The Merchant can deal some damage while generating more cash after battles. The Mage, who is the primary offensive magic user. The Priest, who heals and buffs the party. The Gadabout, who is a gag job, with the only use of turning into the last vocation, the Sage, a magic user with no limitations to which types of spell they can use. This is the only class that can't be picked from the beginning and has to be unlocked later. It's quite a list, huh? Unfortunately, the Merchant and the Gadabout aren't really intended for proper use. I think this should be better communicated by the game. I like their inclusion, but I can imagine people who get excited by these more unique choices only to be screwed over by investing so much into them. In previous versions of the game, the melee classes were a bit underwhelming. Stats-wise, most of them are quite powerful, sure, but they're just kind of boring. I mentioned in my previous video on Final Fantasy I that melee classes in old RPGs are usually just really limited. They might have access to one additional action, but that pales in comparison to the long lists of spells that mages can play with. This is just as true in the port that I played originally. One of the biggest hopes I had for this game is that they would improve their skill sets, and they did exactly that. From newer games, they've added the ability system. While some characters can learn no spells, they can instead learn class-specific abilities. Every ability is entirely unique, unlike magic, which can sometimes be learned by multiple classes. However, they can only be used in battle, unlike spells, which can be used when exploring. And usually a class can learn far fewer abilities than a mage can learn spells. They have their own pros and cons, which is really appreciated. They aren't just glorified spells, they have a unique place in the game. They offer a ton of strategic options with all sorts of builds possible. But Dragon Quest III has a very intelligent twist on the old-style class system. About like a quarter into the game, you can unlock a new feature, by essentially prestiging your characters. You can switch their class and they return to level 1. But they retain all the abilities and spells they learned and half of their original stats. So you can effectively multi-class by mixing and matching stat layouts and techniques. It isn't through some clunky restrictive menu, it's entirely player-driven. Maybe you switch a martial artist into a priest in order to give them incredibly high speed and retain some damage potential, or turn a priest into a warrior to create a paladin type of character, being able to shield from attacks while buffing and healing. It's incredibly in-depth and so well considered. I would say it perfectly represents the core of the Dragon Quest's franchise. Very simple, but amazingly executed. It is elegant because of its simplicity, not despite it. By halving the stats each time you change class, it means that you do get diminishing returns by going further, but you're still fully able to if you don't mind grinding them back up. On top of all this, you're given even more control over your character's stats through the personality system. This is something that was added in the first few remakes of the game, and has quickly become part of its identity. The game begins with a series of questions that God asks you to determine your personality. After giving a few answers, you're put into a scenario. Depending on how you act within this scenario, your personality will be determined. It's very easy to change after the fact, but it's an undeniably cool experience to have. It feels shockingly reactive for a game like this. Some of these scenarios include hearing about a queen's treachery, finding yourself in a cave with strict signs to guide you, or finding yourself between a man and a dancer with a rocky relationship. I wish I could just go through and describe each and every one and each possible action. They're just so cool, but I'm getting sidetracked. Your personality affects certain stat weights. Each time your character levels up, the stat increase depends on what class they are. But then, certain characteristics may increase further or not increase as much depending on your personality. Usually they only affect like one or two main things. While there are a ton of them, thankfully you can find a description of what each and every one of them do in the tutorial menu, which was very appreciated. Each party member you recruit from the pub at the beginning has a random personality, but all personalities in the game can be changed with book items or equipment that forces a temporary one until it's removed. So this gives you 45 more options on top of the classes to build characters how you like, focusing on enhancing their strengths, making up for their weaknesses, or some variation depending on the class. The entire system is great, and it remains diverse and interesting throughout the whole game. I'm going to save talking about the new Monster Wrangler until we discuss the mechanics surrounding it later. As for the rest of combat, it's all relatively simple. Most attacks have different uses or elements, some enemies are weak to different elements, some equipment is designed to take out certain enemies, things like that. Something that might be foreign to newcomers is how selecting your target works. For any attack that only hits a single enemy, you can only target an enemy's group. Sometimes enemies of the same type group together and you can't specify which one of them you'd like to attack. Some abilities, spells, or equipment can target an entire group at once, which can be as little as 2 enemies or even up to double digits, and some can target every enemy on screen regardless of group. Choosing a weapon that deals less damage but can target more is a fun option to have, and makes you think more about the equipment. Almost all late game equipment has some form of passive effect or ability. There's a lot of depth there as well. One complaint I have about the combat is the really weird lack of any auto battle feature. This is a pretty standard mechanic found in most, if not all, turn-based RPGs. You can speed up a battle, which is a nice feature. As you can see, I had mine set to the fastest option nearly the whole game. But it's weird there's no auto battle, and for random encounters it would have been pretty nice. Obviously it is not a major problem, but I absolutely found myself wishing for it multiple times in my playthrough. Especially since they do offer AI tactics. Just let me select the auto battle menu and present those same choices to apply to my party. Instead, you can kind of automatically do it, but it's even slower than normal gameplay. It's very convoluted. But now that we've gone over what combat is like in this game, let's discuss what you'll be doing between all of those impactful fights. Exploration. There are all sorts of areas to explore in the game. There are segments where you make your way through a new town, then the various dungeons, and finally the world map that connects them all. Let's cover these one at a time, as each is pretty texturally different. First, the towns. These are all beautifully rendered. The original grid-based town designs are dramatically improved with a more dynamic layout. Each of the towns vary far more visually than before. They feel so much more lived in and thought out. This was no lazy conversion. I really love all the effort put into each and every house. They are packed full of details that really flesh out every shelf and every corner. In previous versions of 3, the world is littered with barrels, pots, shelves, and all sorts of things that can contain different items. Most of them are empty, but sometimes the items given really suck. But other times, they can contain important gear or even stat-boosting items, though a lot of the time, it was a slog. It basically meant ramming your face into every pot in every room in every town. It definitely begins to drag as the game goes on. So they added a quite tasteful change here, where most of the collection spots are covered visually. Books stacked on top of crates mean you can't open it, some pots are covered, some bookcases don't have a big red book in the middle, and the ones that are available and give you the prompt to search always have items. You will never run up to something, search it, and find it absolutely empty. It's great, you can immediately see what is worth investigating and what can be handily ignored. It also makes you pay closer attention to the fine details to save your time, which really just makes you appreciate the work put into each room. It's a great example to show how graphical enhancement from previous versions can actually affect the gameplay experience. This isn't the SNES version with some shiny new particle effects. The ground-up remake is used to improve some of the weaker elements that every old version had. Though there's still a lot more in towns to go over though, so let's go back into it. Usually the main points of interest are labelled on the map. All the different shops, churches, monster arena, things like that. But since the sizes of towns aren't too large, it's always manageable to just check out each and every room. And you're practically required, so it's good you feel so rewarded for doing so. Many times the story will only continue by talking to a specific NPC or walking in on something happening. Here is where an option at the beginning of the game comes up. If you have quest markers enabled, it shows you where in town you have to go in order to continue. But personally, I don't really want that. I end up just kind of blindly following the icon and ignoring everything else, which makes for a worse experience. So instead, I turned it off, and a marker will only show if I enter the room and already see who I need to talk to. To me, this is the perfect middle ground. When I first played Dragon Quest III, I ended up needing a guide for multiple points throughout the story, just because I didn't realize I had to talk to like one old man in one town that I forgot to check on. but now it gives you a little highlight as to what is completely mandatory without being intrusive or giving me information I shouldn't have yet. I think it really smooths over some frustrating moments from the original. Also found throughout these areas are mini-medals. Mini-medals are a staple of the series and really nothing new here. You find these small medals in chests, sparkly spots, and hidden in places that kind of demand your attention in subtle ways. You bring them to a man in the well of the first town and get rewards for hitting different milestones. I consistently find like only a third of the total amount every time I play a Dragon Quest game, and this is no different. I was delighted to find so many recreated like directly from the original. It is a cute system, but of course nothing too deep. It usually offers some pretty good gear, so if you collect a lot, it can have some of the best in the game near the end. Now let's discuss the dungeons. A problem I have with a lot of older RPGs is that the dungeons are all a little samey. Basically just mazes with a few chests scattered about and that's it. All you get the difference between them is like the sprites and the colours. Without a map, they can be exhausting. This does not apply to Dragon Quest III. The original game already had wonderfully diverse and interesting dungeons, and the remake just improves on them, while even sprinkling on some extra quality on top. These dungeons have various gimmicks and puzzles. Often they use recurring mechanic of being able to fall to lower levels. This can be used to reach otherwise inaccessible areas for treasure and items. It provides the opportunity for more interesting dungeon designs without needlessly revolutionizing how you interact with them. Just a bit more depth. But aside from that, some caves and caverns are quite standard. Winding roads, a couple of optional areas with chests as your reward, things like that. I will say that having a minimap given to you from the first moment makes these dungeons so much nicer to explore. You're never told explicitly where progress is. If there's a fork in the road, you must still decide which way you go without being handheld the whole way. So without removing the exploration, it just makes the journey so much more satisfying. I can assume that this odd little pathway leads to a chest. Sometimes I don't have the resources to go check and see. Other times I do when I welcome the reward, but it's all my decision. I feel no obligation because maybe that's the only road to the boss. I see it's a dead end, so I consider my current resources and get to pick if I check it out or not. I think it's really well designed. The complexity slowly scales as the game goes on, which is used to great effect. The dungeons near the end of the game truly feel like challenges and are just such a treat. One bans the use of magic, causing you to reassess your strategy and rely heavily on the newly added abilities. Others have tiles that rotate your controls and make navigation more risky as you cross thin hallways with drops to either side. And the cherry on top of these dungeons are the newly made visuals. Each boring cave is transformed into gorgeous 3D vistas. The added visuals prevent any dungeons from feeling repetitive, while the original could do very little to actually set them apart. It's a great use of the enhanced graphics and new art direction once again. Finally, let's go over the world map. The world map is a classic JRPG staple that started to fade after the 16-bit era. I'm a big fan of world maps connecting all the towns and dungeons together, but I will also admit that the world map feature is usually quite outdated. When we have things like Xenoblade or Atelier, which is much more open world, the world map can feel just a bit boring. I think usually the biggest problem is that they aren't too interesting to explore. Basically taking the format of a dungeon, just long stretches of random battles as you look for the next town or dungeon. It is fun discovering new places, and expanding where you're able to travel to as the game goes on, but those experiences are stretched out over lots of mindless walking in a single direction. It's not like this game revolutionizes this, but I think it adds just a little bit that it needs. The world map is done as usual, it looks a little fancier, but in comparison to the rest of the visuals, I would actually say it's a little underwhelming. But two new features are added. The first is very simple. Small shining spots are scattered throughout the world. By interacting with them, you can pick up a few items. Some helpful, some useless, but you almost always get something at least a little worthwhile. It's nothing special, but it does breathe a bit more life into walking around. Just small objectives to keep you entertained until you reach whatever you're looking for. More notably, however, are these small special landmarks. On the world map, some parts might stick out a bit more than usual. A big tree, a large rock, things like that. When you approach, you find yourself in a small alcove. Here you might find some items, some NPCs, or some overworld monsters. which brings us to the first entirely new mechanic in HD-2D, monster wrangling. Throughout your journey, you can find monsters hidden in dungeons, towns, and these small areas scattered around the overworld. Interact with them, and they will be added to your ever-growing collection of monster friends. Some may be scared off as you approach, with the reasoning given being a hint on how to actually reach them next time. They serve multiple purposes. Firstly, the improved monster arena, and secondly, the entirely new vocation, Monster Wrangler. So first let's go over the arena. The arena was originally just a gambling den. You would see a matchup and bet on the winner. Very little input, and as far as I'm aware, it was never really the best way to grind for cash either. In my opinion, it didn't really serve much of a mechanical purpose, but just kind of cute world building. They've adjusted the system now, where instead you form your own teams and actually participate in these battles. You don't directly command the monsters, but each turn you can change their AI tactics, which gives you just enough input to feel meaningful. You can find monsters to add to your team throughout the world like I mentioned before. It is a really small but cute system, and the battle rewards have been dramatically increased to the point where I absolutely think it's worth engaging in. I also found the balancing of these battles to be pretty solid. I did have to switch up my team setup, and it wasn't as simple as just using the highest level monsters every time. There's slightly more depth than I'm going to go over, but those are the broad strokes. I would say my biggest issue is that there just aren't that many of them. There's a long stretch where there's like no places to use your monsters, and it feels pretty weird. You find 2 different arenas in the first hours, and then like 10 to 15 hours with none until stumbling upon the next one. Just paced strangely, but I guess they didn't want to add ones that didn't exist in the original game, which I can respect. Next we have the new vocation. The Monster Wrangler is an interesting vocation. It has pretty lackluster stats, but some of the strongest abilities in the game. They are also the only job that gains abilities from things other than level ups. As you reach new milestones of monsters found, you unlock more and more skills. Some are direct copies of skills that monsters have. Others revolve around calling your monster pals to help you in battle. They talk this up a bit in the trailers, but all that means is you can perform multi-hit attacks that increase in strength with your monster count. There's no directly using your monsters. Now this brings up the topic of balancing. I read a lot about how powerful the Monster Wrangler can be. Despite starting slow, in the mid-game it can be one of your strongest attackers, and if you go far enough with monster collecting, it can be the strongest of all by the endgame. I saw some people complaining that it trivializes a lot of the game, but I strongly disagree. First of all, the vocation is paced well. I found it quite weak near the beginning, which is good balance as it gets stronger and stronger. But by the end, I was consistently doing higher damage with other jobs and setups. The only way to achieve the damage I was reading about required collecting way more monsters than I had. I collected almost every monster I found, but I didn't go too far out of my way to find more. I certainly wasn't ignoring the mechanic, however. I was able to beat every monster arena battle in the game, so I definitely wasn't behind. I think it only gets ridiculous when you really farm out this system more than the average player ever will. However, since we are discussing the game's difficulty, I will say the new abilities make your team much stronger than before. This might be an issue. This year I played Persona 3 Reload, an incredible version of my favourite game of all time, but it was significantly drawn back by just how easy the new mechanics made it. I accidentally one-shot the final phase of the final boss. Accidentally, on the hardest difficulty. It really dragged down an otherwise high-quality experience. This is not the case in Dragon Quest III. Firstly, a new difficulty is added, Draconian. I didn't even dare touch it, as I was fighting tooth and nail throughout the whole game on its standard difficulty. A lot of the encounters have been rebalanced to handle your new abilities. Some bosses have different resistances, changed health bars, and skills. I never felt completely out of depth, nor was I easily outclassing bosses. It was always a perfect challenge. And the toughest battles were some of the new ones. Around the middle of the game, you're on a long quest to collect different orbs. Some orbs have entire story segments and boss fights tied to them, such as the Tower of Jupang and Orochi. But other orbs were found without any ceremony at all. Felt anticlimactic showing up and quickly figuring out what you have to do and getting the orb within like half an hour. But now new fights have been added to multiple key parts of the main story. A new boss of the volcano when you throw in the Mountain Cleaver, a particularly tough horde battle in Thedon, things like that. All of it is beyond satisfying and requires vastly different strategies to handle. I found the difficulty in the new bosses to be a delight the whole way through. And now we're going to end on the story, the narrative that carries you through the entire experience. It is an old RPG at its core, so it doesn't have a large, sprawling epic with tons of characters and deep themes. It's quite simple, with a focus on small, local stories. Each area you visit has something to push you forward. Saving the town from Orochi, finding the couple engaged in the forbidden love between humans and pixies, or most strongly, hearing about the exploits of your father Ortega. Your father is on the exact journey as you from the beginning of the game. You find all these people he's met, see memories of his quest, and learn about him and his legacy. You spend almost all of the game trying to catch up to him now that it's finally your turn to venture forth. These segments with Ortega was spruced up a lot for this release. You get proper cutscenes seeing fragments of the past. I found them sort of underwhelming. I like some aspect of his character, but I was always more interested in whatever was happening now. But I think they do manage to condense a solid story in there, mostly about the internal conflict, about doing what's right by the world, by wronging your own family. His regrets and complicated feelings on leaving you and your mother are properly explored and the core of his character. I was happy to see the game display a bit more depth than I'm used to in something like this. But again, it doesn't reach the heights of storytelling the genre is now expected to deliver. My biggest complaint with the narrative is how inconsequential your party members are. While your main character is important to the story, your party members are completely interchangeable blanks. You request some mercenaries from the pub at the beginning of the game, and that's it. It's bizarre. In Dragon Quest II, your party members are fully fledged characters with places around the world and stories surrounding them. In 4, you have multiple chapters dedicated to your party members before beginning the game properly and finding them. I understand this game probably just couldn't fit in any elements like that, and adding it to the remake would be far too transformative than what they wanted. So I don't think it's the largest issue at all. It's just only a problem in its absence, so the game flows perfectly fine without it. It was just the biggest notable weakness in the story. And with that, I've gone over almost all of my thoughts about this game. I think it's a genuine triumph, a real celebration of old school RPGs in the modern era, and a must-play for anyone who is a fan of the genre. They've kept the core of Dragon Quest III untouched, lovingly recreating its best moments in beautiful detail, all while adding to its weaker elements and bringing it to the modern age. To me, this is the ideal of what a remake should be. I only hope this will get more Western players to give the Dragon Quest series a try. Dragon Quest XI did a lot to bring in new fans, so if you're one of them, please do give this game a shot. If you liked hearing my thoughts, subscribe for more. I really like covering JRPGs like this. I hope you have a lovely day. Goodbye.